Rob, let's start with what I want to get to the most with you. You're the ranking member on the Government Administrations and Elections Committee, what's known as the GAE Committee, which covers election law. We've got proposals right now for constitutional changes in balloting. One of them to permit no excuse absentee balloting in Connecticut. Where does that stand, and what does it mean?
So there are two constitutional amendments pending. One for early voting, which has already passed the legislature once in 2019, but because it didn't make the requisite 3/4 vote, it has to be voted on again, and that was voted on in the House just last week. It passed with a 50% plus plurality, so it will go to the Senate. Presumably it will pass there, and that will end up on the ballot very quickly. And the Democrats, not to outdo themselves, want to do another constitutional amendment to follow up right behind that one for no excuse absentee voting. And that has not been voted on yet. And presumably it's going to be voted on in the House, possibly even tomorrow, but certainly by next week. And we're hoping to keep that from reaching the 75%, because if it does happen, that could end up on the ballot very soon also. The danger of no excuse absentee voting is simply that we don't have the technology or any of the necessary infrastructure in place to do it properly. States that have mail-in type voting systems like that, and essentially that's what no excuse absentee voting becomes. And that's what the most important distinction, I think, for people should be, is that this is not going to the polls in person to vote, but it's mail-in voting, and a massive expansion, much like we had last November, where we typically have under 100,000 people voting by absentee statewide, and we had almost 700,000 vote in the last election that way through the mail. That's what's coming, and I presume that's going to go to the House and hopefully not meet the 75%. And I'm doing my best to make sure people understand that if we're going to have no excuse absentee voting in the state, we have got to do the proper protocol along with it, signature verification and audits of elections in a lot of different ways.
And Rob, is it possible, if they have no excuse absentee balloting, could they in fact then mail applications to everybody like they did last year?
Yeah. You know, this is a very difficult conversation, Joe, because there's so much confusion about what our law currently is at the moment and how it might be changed by a constitutional amendment, and also another bill that's going through the legislature known as Senate Bill 901, which we just voted on in the Senate last week. There's so much confusion. The problem is you had the governor passing executive orders to modify our election system. You had the Secretary of State putting out memorandums every other day on the subject. You had the legislature voting on changes to allow for COVID voting. And then you also had the Supreme Court of the state of Connecticut ruling on a lawsuit essentially expanding what the definition in the Constitution of illness is. And it's really hard to say right now what exactly our current situation is. The Secretary of State has always had the power to send out absentee ballot applications. But it would make no sense to mail them to every person, because you need to, under our constitutional requirement, fall in one of the categories. And our system works very well, where if you are going to not be able to vote in person on election day because of illness, or you're out of town, or your job doesn't allow it, you can request one. And that has always been our law, at least in recent decades. And I believe that's the way we should continue. What will happen with this is if we change the definition so that anyone can obtain an absentee ballot, that opens the door essentially to the Secretary of State mailing them out to every person. And I could go on for quite some time about just how out of sync and out of date our voter rolls are in the state.
You know, we'll come back to this after the break, Rob. And I got to say, you probably heard me say before that when I got back in politics, I thought I would form the Deep Breath Party. If there's ever a topic that we ought to pause and take a deep breath and figure out what we're doing before we plunge ahead, it's how we cast our votes.